Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode of Radiate. If you listen to our preview episode, you know that we've got a lot of amazing stories to share with you. And one way we're going to be able to support this venture is with the help of our friends at Midroll. They support many of the people we love to listen to, like Mark Maron, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Aisha Tyler, and the folks at Gimlet Media who produce one of my favorites, Startup. As we build this relationship, we want to keep you, the Radiate listener, in mind. So I would love for you to take a quick survey at podsurvey.com/radiate. It's completely anonymous and will take only 5 minutes. Plus, if you enter your email, you get the chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. We give out one gift card a month. So make sure you go to podsurvey.com/radiate. And even if you've taken it before, we hope you'll take ours to help support Radiate. Thanks for listening and enjoy our conversation with Andrea Jung.
What defines success?
What's going to make you tomorrow's leader is if you can find the solution that perhaps your boss and your boss's boss can't solve.
What happens when you get knocked down?
If you haven't had some lows and some failures, you're really not going to be able to have written a real story.
What makes some people radiate?
I've always sort of had a belief that you don't run out of a burning building, you run into it if you really are a leader.
This is Radiate.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Radiate, the show where we interview some of the world's most successful people to find out how they work their way to the top. This is our inaugural episode, and appropriately, we're kicking it off with someone who's practically seen it all. Andrea Jung is the CEO of Grameen America, a nonprofit microfinance organization. But before that, she was the CEO of Avon, one of the first woman CEOs of a major Fortune 500 company. She graced magazine covers and power lists over and over again. But then, it all came to a grinding halt. Sales began to slow. The stock price fell. Before long, she left to start over. In this conversation, Andrea talks about her upbringing, what she had to overcome as a woman in the corporate world, and the skills that helped her along the way. Here we go. I'm sure a lot of people ask you this, but what's the secret sauce here?
You know, one of the things I have to attribute, whether you call it a secret or the secret to my success, really growing up in a traditional Chinese family, you can probably relate to this. There are a lot of the cultures, the values, and the disciplines that I think have fundamentally shaped who I am, as a person and as an executive. And I think they played a big role. I'll just kind of name a few of them. But, we grew up around the table, with the philosophy that, you don't give up. Yes, it's about hard work, but that nothing's easy and that you have to sort of start from the bottom and work your way. I remember being just out of college, and I started in a training program at a department store at Bloomingdale's. And in those days, the first several months of your training program, really literally I was in the basement changing clothes on hangers. And the only time I ever saw the light of day was, a very small and tight lunch break. And I remember calling my parents and saying, you came to this country, you paid for an Ivy League education. This is not what I should be doing. I really want to quit. And
right.
About, a good amount of the people in the training program by sort of 3 months in Thanksgiving were already starting to quit and look for other jobs. And, I sort of was right in the pack. And my parents said, you don't quit. You start at the bottom and you work way up. Did you think it was going to be so easy? We didn't, raise you to be a quitter. Mm-hmm. You've got to persevere. And that sort of stayed with me, and I stayed. And I became, in those early days, one of the youngest vice presidents, and ended up having a really, amazing opportunity at a very young age to lead. Mm-hmm. And if it hadn't been for some of the value systems and the kind of upbringing that I had, family-wise, and sort of the do's and don'ts from mom and dad, I may not be sitting here today. So that is a big secret. I had a boss once who had a poster behind his desk that was of a potted plant. It was like a tree in a pot. And when anyone used to come in and complain, I'm not getting promoted fast enough, I don't like my boss, I don't want to do this job anymore, he would point to the poster and say, bloom where you're planted. And that also is something that I think, kind of goes hand in hand with this thought of perseverance. I mean, there have been many jobs I didn't love, many people I didn't love working for, but you kind of try and learn from that. You take a boss and you take their style and you say, I don't want to be that kind of boss.
Yeah.
And take a tough situation and kind of make it a learning experience. And so sort of perseverance and sticking it through, those have been some of the more foundational learning experiences that made me a better leader in the end.
But you talked about this before. I remember I was watching, I think it was the Maker's video on you, where you said something like, because you had been passed over, I think, once for the top job at Avon, but you said I could have actually left, but I decided to stay instead. So is that the upbringing speaking?
Yeah, that was the upbringing. But there, I would say equally, the other secret, which I hope I'm not exclusively someone who has this, is there it really came down to passion for the work. Mm-hmm. So, to me, another definer besides sticking it out and perseverance is you have to love what you do. And a job is a job. Any career is even a career. But passion kind of rises above all things. And I have seen people who have been enormously bright, enormously successful, but they actually just didn't love their job. Mm-hmm. Names not, shared here, but, people who've been extremely successful by somebody's like definition in investment banking who they hate it.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And lawyers.
Right. So I was at Avon in the early 90s, and there was, so much visibility to kind of at that time women breaking through or not the glass ceiling. And in that time, there were only, a couple, two, I think, women who were CEOs in the Fortune 500, myself being eventually the third. But in those early days, 1997, so the late 90s, there really weren't women, in the C-suite, never mind in the corner office. And I had been told that I was the front runner for the job. And then the business, took a turn. There were some challenges, and they decided, we're going to be more comfortable with someone who's, a man who had been on the board, who had had the job before. So I was passed over for the job. And at that time, several publications, including the New York Times, front page business, really made a big article about the glass ceiling is still alive and well, and women get passed over for the job. And, as a result of that, because I had a good reputation, I was offered 2 CEO jobs immediately. And I had...
Funny how that happens, right?
Funny how that happens, isn't it? But I had a mentor who had given me a piece of advice that was essentially, follow your compass, not your clock. Not everything is just about the job, the title, and everything that comes with it. It's just, do you love what you do? And so it was an inflection point for me in my life as well as my career, that the concept of, I can stay here and be number 2. And, the guy who was given the job was in his early 50s. So it wasn't like I was going to get the job in a couple of years. It wasn't like he was 64 and just going to do it for a year. It was,
right.
I was sort of agreeing, if I stayed, not to get the CEO job. Or go right then and there and, have the title and everything that came with running my own show. But I guess the compass in me and the passion I had for the work, the kind of business we were in, empowering women, and actually even some of the challenges the company was going through, I felt a loyalty to the team and to the people. And I've always sort of had a belief that you don't run out of a burning building, you run into it if you really are a leader. So I thought, I can either kind of get out of this situation, go get a great job. Most people might say, why wouldn't you do that? Mm-hmm. But something in me was saying, I love the people. They kind of need a leader that knows them. So some kind of transition. I never woke up saying I have to be the CEO. That wasn't my end goal. I guess really my end goal was to do work that I loved, to be able to contribute at a level and be involved in work that I'm passionate about. And so I made the decision to stay. And, as it happens,
a couple of years
he
later,
wasn't successful, not even, 18 months later.
18 months.
They removed him from the job, and I got it. And, sort of the rest is history. But having said that, if I go back and look at it and say to myself, so if I knew that then, of course, most people would say you would do it. But, if he had been successful, let's say, and he wasn't removed and, you would have been actually the number 2 at Avon and not the number 1, would you have, if you had known that, would you have still stayed? And I think my answer would have been, I wasn't wanting to leave. I wasn't wanting to leave for a title. I think that my career advice for people, young and, not young, is that it's very hard to find work that you love. It's much harder to find work that you love than work. And many people make a change to run from something as opposed to running to the right thing. And I felt like that would have been my situation. I would have been running to something that sounded better, had a bigger title.
Exactly.
But maybe didn't have the purpose or the mission that I actually personally was as drawn to or as I had so much fulfillment from. So it worked out, obviously to be game changing for my whole life and my career, because it was obviously a stepping stone to a huge responsibility and privilege of the role, but also with particular work empowering women in 100+ countries that, changed my vantage point and has a lot to do with what I'm doing today, even here at Grameen America. But I go back to that point in my life, which was a big decision. And it really was about choosing something that was not just in my head, but, you have to have the heart for your work.
What was it like when you actually finally... What was it like when you finally got into that CEO role? I'm just curious. Yeah, what was it like?
I was the, one of 3 women in the role, and
did your life change overnight?
Yes. It was kind of a whirlwind, and all of a sudden, it certainly got a lot of press because there weren't many women or minorities in the job.
Or a woman and a minority.
And a woman and a minority in the job. I felt internally, it was interesting because you go from being a peer, and so it didn't come from the outside. I was an internal promotion, and I was somebody that everybody knew. So that, on one hand, was great, but all of a sudden you go to be their boss. And so people that you went out to lunch with and out to drinks with, complaining about people, all of a sudden you're it, right? You can't do that anymore. So now I always remember that when I was in, a middle management job, I would get into the elevator. And if the CEO got in the elevator, I would be like, oh my God, why did I get into this elevator? What am I going to say all the way down to the first floor? And I remember after becoming the CEO, people would walk in the elevator and I'm thinking to myself, are they thinking that? Are they thinking, oh,
yes.
Shoot, I got in the wrong elevator in this bank. Do I have to talk to her all the way down? And
it was uncomfortable for you too, right?
I kind of made a commitment from that point, you know what? I'm not that old and it hasn't been too long ago that was me. So, I really wanted to go out of my way to make people feel comfortable that,
Right.
I'm just I'm lucky I have this role, but I've been in your seat, and I really don't want this to be oh my gosh, it's the CEO in the office.
The big boss.
The big box who doesn't really know what's going on and isn't like a normal person. So internally, I had the fortune of knowing everybody and having everybody's support, but I also had to transition into being the CEO, where, look, it's a tough job. Everything that's great, you get the credit for, but more importantly, everything that's bad, no matter what, you own it. Doesn't matter whether it happened at the lowest level. People always say it's a lot of responsibility and it's a lonely job, and that's an understatement. It's impossible unless you've been in that seat to understand that, everything ladders up no matter what it is, and you can't do everything and do everybody's job, but it's just you take the accountability on, certainly in a public company, and it's a big mantle.
When we continue, Andrea tells us how to handle our emotions at work, even the urge to cry. But first, this. This episode of Radiate is brought to you by Pipedrive. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, selling can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. Pipedrive is the CRM for small teams with big ambitions. They take the pain and frustration out of tracking deals with email or spreadsheets. Salespeople and entrepreneurs love Pipedrive because it visualizes your sales pipeline, highlighting opportunities and potential problems. It ensures important activities and conversations don't get dropped. And sales managers love it because they don't need to nag their teams to use their CRM. Pipedrive is easy to use and simple to get started. You can be up and running in minutes. If you need extra help, Pipedrive also has great tutorials, and this is important, an incredibly supportive response team. Some other cool things about Pipedrive include forecasting, iOS and Android mobile apps, some great integrations with the likes of Google Apps, MailChimp, Zapier, Yesware, and many more. It's also got a powerful API for those that like to build their own software solutions. Head over to pipedrive.com/radiate to start your 30-day free trial today. So I want to talk a little bit in the time that we have, a little bit about your personal life in terms of your own career, your ups and downs, right?
Yeah.
So tell me, what was and because we talk a lot about this with all the people that we've interviewed, your career low. Like, tell me, what was a moment where you struggled and how did you get out of it?
Oh, those are, so many, because, I think I'm a big believer that, if you haven't had some lows and some failures, you're really not going to be able to have written a real story. So I think,
you wouldn't have lived
everybody,
if you don't have lows.
If you didn't, you wouldn't have lived. You wouldn't have risked enough. You wouldn't have been in a job long enough. Mm-hmm. I have more than we have time for, on this.
So pick one.
Wonderful, but let's just see one. One really important one I would just say is when I did not fight my board hard enough on a decision that I think had huge implications for the company. And it was a big learnings because, any CEO, obviously, you've got to deal with the board. And board governance is really important. Boards have to be independent. But, I had an instinct, and, I just, if I have, and all of us have some, if I have a regret, I wish I had, really fought harder, because in the end, I think my instinct proved itself right. But at that point, we'd incurred a lot of cost that we shouldn't have.
And when was this around?
And this was in the past 5 years.
Oh, okay.
Past 5-8 years. And so, it's recent, but it was a lesson learned for me, for sure.
Was this during the time when it was, a lot of scrutiny on Avon, right? There was talk about the stock price, talk about the sales targets, talk about SEC inquiry. Was this during the time? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, certainly it's a tough time. When I look back, I certainly was 20 years with the company, 13 years and, 52 quarters of being a public company CEO, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And there was certainly a lot of cycles. And then the last couple years, some of the challenges that we faced came with external challenges, some internal challenges. But through it all, you do realize the real importance of making sure everybody is aligned on decisions that you make as management, but also as a board. So that was one lesson. I can go back even in history, though, in Avon. I remember I took a risk, and there's no question about it. And we decided to have a retail venture. Now, we weren't selling the same brand, but we decided to create a line and a brand that was sold at retail. And that was...
Was that Mark?
No, it was called Becoming.
Becoming,
but,
okay.
We really felt that we needed to see if we needed to venture out beyond just direct sales. And the lessons learned there, it didn't succeed. It was I think the right idea with the wrong partners. Mm-hmm. But having said that, what was my big lesson learned? You know what? Make the decision fast to kill it. Everybody's going to make a mistake. The worst thing that you can do when you make one, my advice would be, from the front lines, is kind of hold on to it a long time. I think, you've got to be able to, as a CEO and as a leader, you have to be able to admit when you've made a mistake and move on.
Yeah.
As opposed to drag it out just because you authored it. And so therefore admitting that it wasn't good would be wrong. So you just keep going. So we killed it.
It's like pride, maybe.
Yeah.
Ego.
One of the things that, I like to think is the way I would counsel anyone, any young leaders, is fail forward. Mm-hmm. If you don't fail, you haven't risked. But if you make the same mistake twice, then that's a problem. So, learn from it and use that failure to kind of move forward and be a better person, leader, and organization because of it.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Right?
so absolutely. And I like, Barbara Corcoran, who has been on our show a few times, she'll say, she said to me one time that, the people who are most successful are those who, when they fail, they'll just get up the next morning and do the same thing, do the same thing, get up, pick themselves up and just make the same phone calls and go on. I like to modify that a little bit where, like, if I fail, at least I get one pass that I can go home and cry my eyes out and like eat a big tub of ice cream
and
then I'll put my suit and my lipstick back on.
And
like, did you ever have moments? I mean, like,
all the time. Like,
because you're so well put together. It's like, do you ever just go home and like,
absolutely, head at the end of the bed and not wanting,
yes,
the thing that's hard, but the thing that's important is, you forget that everybody's looking. Everybody's looking at you. Is she
She's
okay?
a woman. Yeah.
And you have to just keep going. And you have to just do whatever you do, either at home over a tub of ice cream or in your office behind the closed doors. But when you walk out, people are depending on you. And I've seen leaders in crisis situations who the stress, they wear it. But then everybody who's following them, is going to have an impact of that. So you've got to suck it up, and you've got to go out there, and you've got to motivate the people, even if you are freaking out, and you can't let them know. Because if they just think, well, our leader
is freaking out,
then let's all just freak out and let's have a multiplication of this freak out session. And it's not productive. So you've got to kind of suck it up, no matter what you're thinking inside.
So do you put your game face on?
You just have to put your game face on, and you have to, like, if people. I mean, I've heard people say, well, she's still smiling, so things must be okay. And I didn't actually even think about that, but the implication, every facial expression, every sign, it's taken and magnified, because that's what leadership is. Look at Obama. I mean, anybody. I mean, heads of state. I mean, everybody is scrutinized, and it just comes with the territory. And if you don't have thick skin, get over it. I was at the White House with George W. Bush at a state dinner for President Hu when he was the president of China, and I had the distinct pleasure of sort of sitting next to the president, and on the other side was his mom. And there were a couple things at dinner that I'll always remember. One is a mother's a mother, because Barbara Bush said to him, "You're eating too fast." That was like my very favorite line at the dinner. But my second favorite line...
That's hilarious.
And this was just after all of the, I'll call it the media discussion about New Orleans, okay? Mm-hmm. He said to me, you know what? I don't read it. I just go to bed. I'm going to get a summary of it, but if I sit there and read, you're always somewhere in between how great people say you are to how bad people, the truth is always somewhere in between. I'm just not going to read about it, and I'm just going to keep plowing, because I just can't let it get me down. You just got to keep leading.
Have you, by the way, ever cried at work?
Oh, a million times.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I have had the extraordinary privilege, and I've done it too at Grameen, of crying at work from emotional joy at the work we're doing. I remember being at Avon events, listening to some of these women whose lives had changed. And I mean, I was weeping listening. And here at Grameen, we've had a lot of people whose lives and their families' lives have been fundamentally impacted. And when I hear the stories that some of them tell of, I met a woman who essentially was a victim of domestic violence. She had a young child. She was living in the subway station until she got a $1,500 loan from us, by which she invested in sort of renting a chair in a salon. And today she kind of runs that salon, and she's got employees, and she's, kid is educated, and she's been able to, make it out of that poverty and situation. And it brings happily a tear to my eye that A, it's so inspirational, and B, that I can be involved in that work. So I often tear up.
But those are good tears.
But have I actually gotten upset? In cried in the office? Yes, there's no question about it. And do I think I'd been in a situation with just a few people when the situation got got really tough? Absolutely. I mean,
Me
I think
too.
people who tell you they don't either haven't felt enough about what they do, cared enough about it, because to me it's a sign of caring and being emotionally invested. If you don't really care and you don't give a whatever about it, that's another story.
So just to wrap up, I mean, you said a little bit early on about like what the secret sauce was, but what would be the one piece of advice that you would give someone that is beyond the usual, follow your passion, work hard, stay tenacious? Like, what would be like one piece of advice you could give someone?
I think you have to be constantly willing to change, not who you are, but how you work. I think that any industry is rapidly evolving so unbelievably quickly that if you can get stayed in kind of, I do it this way and I like doing it this way, I think it's game, set, match. Whether you're in journalism and, who knows about print versus digital, or whether you're, in banking and no one's ever going to come to a branch anymore because everybody's going to do everything. Technology, in this era, I think the rapid speed of businesses completely going defunct unless change is rapid. That's what's happening. And what that implies to young men and women alike is that, you may be trained on something 1 year and then 6 months later, you're going to have to do it a completely different way. And you have to be flexible and you have to be adaptive and you have to be, I guess, hungry and curious to learn and to change. And people who don't adapt to change, I've been surprised at some people in even the young generation that kind of get stuck in their ways, and that's the way the company told me to do it, and that's the way I'm doing it, and I really don't want to do it a different way. And, it's one thing if you're 4 decades into a company, but if you're young, you need to expect to be required to change all the time, change how you are actually doing your job and change how, and be a change agent for the company. So that's one. And the second thing I would say is that, be the solution. I am always impressed with young people who come up to me and say, here's what I have to say to you. 25% of it is the problem that you should know about is going on in your company, and 75% of it is here's how I would fix it. It is alarming to me when someone comes and says, do you know that this is the problem? And they spend 75% or 80% of the time just complaining about legitimately what's wrong. The people that are going to differentiate, leaders don't want to hear the problems.
They know
it's
the
not
problem.
that they don't know that there aren't the problems. They want help on the solution. So the people that are going to get ahead in this country, in any industry, are the people who are going to come and solve the issues that our generation or this, administration, whatever it is, can't solve. And so I am a big believer that the number one thing that I think will differentiate and help the next generation of leaders is that if they bring the solutions to government, solutions to companies, identify quickly what the problem is, be pretty sure your boss knows what they are. It's not going to be the first time your boss heard it. But obviously, it's hard to fix. Otherwise, it would have been fixed. No companies rarely have an intention of not fixing the problems. It's just they're overwhelming. So then if you decide you're going to be the young leader, and it's not even in your job description, but you're going to take on helping make that work. One of the things that I did very early on in my career that probably was a differentiator, not some of the things I talked about, was, you know what? It's not even in my job description. It's not my department, but it's an issue, and I'm actually going to get people and we're going to solve it. And I'm going to present it to management after we have a solution. And it's going to take hours that aren't in my day job, and they may not want to go for it. And that's the risk I'm going to take because they didn't ask me to do it because I wasn't assigned to it. So I think you have to have that initiative. But, my headline would be, there are problems. And what's going to make you tomorrow's leader is if you can find the solution that perhaps your boss and your boss's boss can't solve. And if you can find the solution, you should be the next leader. So earn the right. Shame the company into promoting you because you had such a great idea. Right? So that's what I believe.
Next week on Radiate, Steve Schwartzman. We hear how a kid from Philadelphia created one of the largest firms on Wall Street. Thanks for joining us. I'm Betty Lou. If you liked what you heard, please review us on iTunes and find me on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. See you next week on Radiate.